Viewers like you make this program possible. Support your local PBS station.
Every day, history is traded all over the world. Poignant, bizarre, and unique items that may never have been seen in public before. A fascinating and often untold tale lies behind every object.
It looks pretty gruesome, but actually the reality behind it is probably far more gruesome than the object itself.
This may be our last chance to see them before they disappear forever into private collections. Our quest? To unearth extraordinary objects drawn from every corner of the world and reveal the amazing hidden histories behind them.
My father was shot down by this man, Schnaufer. His plane is right at the top. The 29th of June, 1943.
On this episode of Trading History, a rare artifact from the most successful night fighter pilot of all time.
Possibly one of the most iconic items we've ever had for sale.
This isn't any old tail fin. This is one of the most significant tail fins out there.
An entire museum of bizarre finds goes up for sale.
This is a seriously rare thing. I've never seen one in private hands before.
There aren't many places that can handle a 17-metre-long Diplodocus.
And a rare set of tools that helped build some of the finest architecture the world has ever known.
And that makes them extraordinary things to hold in your hand.
Far-flying Nazi squadrons ranged deep into Poland.
In World War II, the battle for air supremacy was of utmost importance. This unique survivor of that battle bears the dubious distinction of belonging to the Nazis' #1 night fighter.
When we look at these artifacts, we're not just looking at specific items, we're looking at the history of the world.
The Messerschmitt, one of the most lethal German fighter planes of the Second World War. When the Allies took on the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain in 1940, the twin-engine plane failed to perform. It got a pounding from the Allies' Hurricane bombers and Spitfires.
Quality of men and machines won that great battle. The same superiority will win final victory.
But once the Messerschmitt had been specially modified for night attacks, the tables turned. It started to wreak havoc in the skies over Europe. Now a slice of that German flying history is up for sale.
We have rather an amazing museum piece item. It's that tail fin from a Messerschmitt Bf 110 that belonged to Heinz Schnaufer.
This is a unique connection with the most successful night fighter ace of all time. This isn't any old tail fin. This is one of the most significant tail fins out there.
The story of this piece of World War II memorabilia is also the extraordinary tale of Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, the man responsible for bringing down more Allied aircraft at night than any other fighter pilot in history. This Messerschmitt tail fin was retrieved from wreckage after the war and has been brought to this auction house by its current owner, a German aviation historian.
It was a straightforward phone call from Germany saying, I have this tail fin, I can't sell it in Germany because of the swastika, where it's not allowed to be sold or traded. And he drove it over and had a couple of days in the Cotswolds and drove home again.
The ace fighter pilot wasn't flying this plane when it went down, but the tail fin's provenance is undisputed. It bears Schnaufer's fingerprint, 121 black plane icons and dates, each representing an Allied aircraft shot out of the sky by the ace pilot. What's more, these marks are identical to those on tail fins from 2 other Schnaufer planes currently in museums in Britain and Australia. One person who understands the human cost behind this roll call of dates is Celia York.
My father was shot down by this man, Schnaufer, in 1943, and we've just been looking at the tail fin, and his plane is right at the top there. And it's the 29th of June, 1943. He ended up as a POW for 2 years. He never, ever talked about it, so the family knew nothing about his exploits. So it's only after he died that I got interested in doing a bit of research, and I ended up with this information that it was Schnaufer that shot him down. So seeing this tail fin is fantastic for me.
German-born Schnaufer joined the Führer's Luftwaffe as a trainee officer pilot in 1939, at the beginning of the Second World War. Between 1942 and 45, the speed and size of his killing spree against Allied aircraft was phenomenal. It began in June 1942, when the ace pilot downed his first plane, a Halifax bomber. By December of that year, he'd chalked up 7 kills. Then, in February 1945, came his greatest coup. 9 Lancaster bombers downed, 7 in just 19 minutes. By the time Schnaufer had hung up his wings in March 1945, he had shot down 121 Allied planes at the cost of more than 700 lives. So how did he do it? In 1942, the Allies' bombing offensive against the enemy changed. The Americans had entered the war, and the US Army Air Force focused on precision daytime bombing across Nazi-occupied Europe. Their main weapon? The B-17 Flying Fortress.
The two groups make rendezvous over the English Channel. And with the fighters patrolling the skies around the bomber formation, the Air Armada moves into enemy territory.
The British shifted to nighttime missions in Halifax and Lancaster bombers, specifically targeting the civilian populations in Germany's industrial cities.
Searched out enemy targets at great height through the heaviest overcast, signaling the right moment for bombs away.
This forced Nazi Germany to rethink its air campaign.
The night air defense of Germany brought out a whole new generation of highly successful fighter aces, men who had specific skills getting in close and firing heavy bursts of ammunition into these large and well-defended targets to kill them.
The success of the Messerschmitt fighter pilot against Allied night bombers was in part down to a new addition: radar. The Germans used it to identify incoming bombers miles away. Closer to home, the German Bf-110 could lock onto Allied targets using its own onboard system. It turned them into lethal nighttime war machines.
By 1944, the Bf-110 was almost obsolete in terms of daytime combat. It was too slow, it was too vulnerable. But in nighttime combat against heavy 4-engine bombers, it could carry the radar and the firepower it needed to shoot down these aircraft before they could reach their targets. It becomes a really successful killing machine.
Another advantage of the Messerschmitt Bf-110 was its firepower. Armed with cannon and machine guns, the fast, nimble plane, flown by pilots like Schnaufer, could get among the formations of bombers and bring them to their knees.
The Messerschmitt has more firepower than the bombers, enough firepower to cut through the fabric of a bomber, destroy it. You can't see what's coming. All of a sudden, incoming rounds, plane is falling to pieces, things are exploding. Casualties were high. 55,000 Bomber Command crew did not return from their missions.
The Allied aircrew who survived at the hands of Messerschmitt pilots usually ended up as prisoners of war.
560, 580, looking for 600, 580 with you, 620
And now, the auction of Schnaufer's tail fin is underway.
This is the tail fin of Heinz Schnaufer, possibly one of the most iconic items or historical artifacts we've ever had for sale.
And Celia York is here to watch the drama, happy to see the memento bearing the mark of her father's plane find a new owner.
Apparently it might go for quite a lot of money, but unfortunately I don't have that amount of money. But as long as I've got a photograph of it, that's fine.
It's going once, twice.
The artifacts of war have always had a very powerful glamour. They reflect part of the past that helped to shape the present. So these are part of the history that made the world the way it is.
Schnaufer himself was highly decorated for his flying achievements, but having dodged death in combat, he was to die in a car accident in France 5 years later, aged 28. An ignominious end to a career which marked him out as the highest-scoring night fighter ace in the history of aerial warfare.
Without the story, it's just a tail fin, but with the Schnaufer connection, it's really telling a story, and when people buy at auction, it's the story they're buying, not just the item.
The tail fin went back to a private collector, but the memory of Schnaufer and the men he shot down will continue to live on through these simple but powerful symbols. It's not often you get the chance to buy a 24-foot-long, 70-million-year-old dinosaur. But just such a beast has appeared at an auction for eager buyers to get their teeth into. Auctioneer Rupert van der Werf and fossil expert Errol Fuller are preparing for one of the most important auctions of their careers.
5, 6, 7. So it's just over 7 meters long.
Going under the hammer in just a few days is a unique group of creatures frozen in time for millions of years. A collection of this magnitude has never been seen at auction before. One by one, these museum-quality specimens will be sold off.
And lot 38 now. It's the giant squid fossil.
It's an incredible opportunity to own a relic dating back to the time of the dinosaurs.
Well done.
Within the myriad of rocks and bones are some incredibly rare specimens.
Rare is a word that gets used a lot, but in this collection there are lots of things that I'd never seen before, and the chances are I'll never see again.
Bringing together long-dead animals, the collection will take us on a journey through time.
This is the forerunner of the modern horse. It's 60 million years old. It hadn't yet evolved hoofs.
The toes are still separate.
This is a seriously rare thing. I've never seen one in private hands before. This is a Brontotherium. They were found mostly in the United States. This was a kind of rhinoceros-like creature that lived 40, 50 million years ago. And they lived in the places that we now call Wyoming, Nebraska, places in the Midwest or far west of the United States.
But how did this historically important collection of petrified monsters end up for sale on the open market? The story starts in the Netherlands, in Northern Europe. In the 1980s, the curators of the zoo in the northeastern town of Emmen decided to create a very special fossil collection.
They were fortunate in that they were buying at a time when a lot of material was freely available on the market, and many of the countries that the items have come from have now stopped the export of fossils.
They travelled the world gathering together an incredible group of stone creatures.
They had a lot of money and they bought the very best items.
But the focus of the zoo's work moved into conservation of existing species. The zoo was left with an amazing anthology of fossils it no longer needed. There was just one man who was up to the task of selling it. Rupert already had a reputation for working with big beasts, having been asked to sell a dinosaur skeleton in 2013.
There aren't many places that can handle a 17-metre-long Diplodocus.
Presented with this unique opportunity, Rupert wasn't about to let just anyone handle the valuable relics.
I actually drove a lorry over to the north of Holland and packed it all up myself and brought it back. I didn't want to entrust it to somebody that I wasn't confident in.
Fossilization is a process that can take anything from thousands to millions of years. Fossils themselves are the impressions left in the rock from the remains of extinct prehistoric plants and animals. There are 2 fossils in the collection that are particularly rare and valuable.
Something properly old, from the Permian period, which is 300 million years, give or take. A sort of shark called an orthocanthus, which was a very primitive shark. The imprint is fantastic. You get a real sense of what this creature would have looked like.
Fossils of sharks are particularly unusual because although they have a skeleton, that skeleton is made of cartilage. Actual fossils of the whole shark itself are incredibly rare.
This giant squid perfectly illustrates the mysterious process of flesh being turned into stone.
This is the seabed, 155 million years ago. Squid died, sank to the bottom of the sea, and it must have got covered.
That would have to have happened very, very quickly, I'd have said.
But the star of the show is the 12-foot-high skeleton of the dinosaur affectionately known as Freya.
So the duck-billed dinosaur, probably about 70 million years old.
So this was a herbivore?
Yeah, this was. These teeth, we imagine, were used for crushing vegetable matter.
At more than 3 meters high, Freya towers over the rest of the collection. In fact, her scientific name, Hypacrosaurus, literally means nearly the highest lizard. She was excavated by paleontologists in America, and it's the Midwest that takes center stage in an incredible event known as the Bone Wars, where almost all of the iconic dinosaurs we know today were found. The frenzy to discover more skeletons peaked in the 1870s. Amidst the heat and dust of huge bone digs in Colorado and Wyoming, competing fossil hunters Edward Cope and Othniel Marsh resorted to extreme measures to outdo each other. Intense rivalry allegedly reduced the men to brandishing revolvers and even sabotaging each other's work with dynamite. But it was good news for science. In all, they discovered more than 30 new species, bringing us, amongst others, the Triceratops and the Stegosaurus. Towering above almost all of them would have been Freya, and Rupert and Errol are mightily impressed.
The skull itself is amazing.
It was found in Montana, which is where one of the places where Tyrannosaurus is found. So it's virtually certain that they ate these.
Could Freya herself have been a victim of Tyrannosaurus before she was immortalized in stone? Partial skeletons of T-Rex were dug up in the early years of the 20th century, but it wasn't until 1990 that the most complete Tyrannosaurus rex was discovered. An amazing 85% of the original animal was found in the earth of South Dakota.
What people don't realize is when they walk around a museum is that the dinosaur skeleton might look absolutely perfect and complete, but much of it has been restored.
Replacing lost parts of an ancient skeleton is a skilled business and involves taking a cast of the missing bone from existing specimens. The replicas are almost as realistic as the originals, and the result brings the skeleton to life.
30–40% would be considered fairly complete for a dinosaur, whereas this is going to be something like 90%.
Thankfully, Freya hardly needed any replacement bones. Having such a complete skeleton means that Freya is highly prized in the world of dinosaur collecting. Rupert and Errol have high hopes for the sale of their star attraction. It's the day of the big sale in Sussex. Hopeful bidders are gathering, keen to own a piece of ancient history.
Any thought that there might be bargains to be had at auctions always elicits a lot of interest. Now is the moment of truth. Right, so we start lot 1, and the first of the pieces in the Yemen Museum collection.
As the cast of this prehistoric show find new homes across the globe, one very special dinosaur begins a new leg of her journey.
And Freya is sold.
Freya will be travelling 9,000 kilometres to a museum in Thailand, where she'll once again wow the crowds. The auction of this amazing group of fossils has shown us mankind's desire to understand life on Earth. Brought together from all corners of the globe, a collection of this kind may never come up for sale again. From the might of the dinosaurs to the might of the pen, William Shakespeare is arguably the world's most famous author. And this next object is connected with Shakespeare in the most unexpected way.
It's a way of providing a direct connection to these figures from history.
Stratford-upon-Avon, home to one of the world's greatest playwrights, William Shakespeare, and the stage for a tragedy that could have come from the pages of one of his own plays. The drama features a souvenir cup, an act of jealousy, and a mutilated mulberry tree, and at its heart, the provenance of the great bard himself.
If you're looking to make that direct connection to Shakespeare, a piece of the mulberry wood tree is perhaps the closest you're going to get.
And antiques dealer Tim Millett believes he has struck lucky with this wooden cup he bought at auction.
This is a covered cup made from the mulberry tree from Shakespeare's garden, beautifully engraved, and around the base it says Shakespeare's mulberry tree, and you have images of a mulberry tree all around the side.
But how can Tim be so certain his carved antique is made from the very tree that belonged to Shakespeare? The story of the cup's history harks back about 400 years, when the great bard lived at New Place, Stratford-upon-Avon, now the site of a park.
Shakespeare was alive at the time of James I, and James I was very keen to encourage the silk weaving business, and in order to get silk weaving going, they needed mulberry trees.
Shakespeare, keen to keep favour with the king, set about growing the tree in his garden upon which the humble silkworm feeds. For more than a century after Shakespeare's death, the tree thrived, and so did Shakespeare's reputation.
So the appeal of Shakespeare quite quickly reaches around the world. Obviously starts with our sort of neighbours in Europe, and then as Britain sort of expands its interests around the world, the plays of Shakespeare go with them. A good example would be in our earliest visitors' book that survives from 1815. The first name in the visitors' book is a gentleman who's come all the way from Boston, Massachusetts. So even sort of 200-300 years ago, the interest in Shakespeare is not just confined to the British Isles, but does reach around the world.
By the 1750s, though, the tree was in peril. New Place was occupied by the Reverend Francis Gastrell, a man frustrated by his home's Shakespearean connections.
He gets a bit fed up with tourists, early tourists visiting, wanting to see Shakespeare's mulberry tree, Shakespeare's house, and so in 1756 he chops the tree down, and then in 1759 demolishes the property completely.
Thankfully, this act of vandalism did not spell the end of Shakespeare's horticultural legacy. Aware of the lucrative worldwide appeal of all things connected to Shakespeare, the story goes that local entrepreneur Thomas Sharp bought the felled mulberry tree and carved the wood into fashionable souvenirs.
And that's where that souvenir industry originates. But I think he was perhaps ahead of his time in seeing an opportunity to make money off of a famous person from the local area.
These are some of those souvenir items, carefully stored here in the archive of Shakespeare's Birthplace Trust, and entrusted to Head of Collections, Paul Taylor. The item's direct link back to Shakespeare's mulberry tree is undisputed.
All of the items that we have in the collection here that are made by Thomas Sharp have been stamped with his name, with Stratford-upon-Avon, and with Shakespeare's wood, or a slight variation on. So he wants people to know that Thomas Sharp is the person you go to if you want authentic mulberry wood souvenirs from Shakespeare's own tree.
So could Tim's cup be one of those very mulberry wood souvenirs crafted by the hand of Thomas Sharp? To be certain, Tim has brought it in to get Paul's expert opinion.
So before we look at your cup, Tim, I thought we'd have a look at some of the mulberry wood items in our collections here.
The Trust's collection of Thomas Sharp-produced items is far-ranging.
There's a little souvenir medal. It's a pastry cutter.
Right.
So it's sort of a real delicate.
And this is
piece of wood.
also by Thomas
Yeah,
Sharp.
and you can see it. So you've got Sharp and then Sharp of Stratford-upon-Avon on the back there. This is the genuine thing.
Yes, brilliant.
Time to see if Tim's cup is made from the original mulberry tree.
There's the base. There's the lid. And I'll be very interested to hear what you've got to say about it.
Oh, so it's, yeah. Oh, it's lovely, isn't it?
You always look at something and think, well, if that was a museum exhibit, and I've often had interest from America for this kind of thing, for an institution, I thought, well, that would look very nice.
No, it's very displayable.
Yeah,
nicely lit and everything around it.
Yeah.
So does it have that all-important provenance?
So perhaps if we have a look inside the lid to see if there's any marks or anything in there. So there's nothing recorded there.
Sadly, no authenticating Thomas Sharp stamp. But there's still hope.
There are other features of the items that can be used to help with that identification. Quite often carvings that reflect the mulberry tree itself, whether that's the berries, the leaves, the intertwining of the branches, so that's quite a common feature. Some of the items then also have a carving of Shakespeare, and then items such as the pastry cutter really doesn't have any similar decorative features, but the style of the carving, even though the patterns themselves are different, you can see some similarities. This beautiful carving of the mulberry berries, isn't it, on top? Shakespeare's mulberry wood.
Now for the moment of truth.
It doesn't seem to follow the pattern of the items we've looked at. When we look at Tim's cup, I think there's a marked difference in perhaps some of the quality of the carving. There's some really intricate carving on there. The wood itself is a slightly darker colour and has a motto along the bottom. Not many of the Thomas Sharp items we have that a motto that isn't simply I'm Thomas Sharp and I made this identification. All of which I think leads us to conclude that it's not a Thomas Sharp original item, but it is a beautifully carved piece of mulberry wood souvenir.
The news is disappointing, but there's one ray of hope for Tim.
Other trees that claim to be sort of descendants, sort of cuttings or grafts, were taken from the tree, and those other trees still survive, including one in New Place Gardens, which is still there.
So Tim's mulberry wood cup could be a distant relative of Shakespeare's tree.
Whether it's one of those sort of descendant trees, quite, possibly. I think regardless of whether we can say it's sharp, it's a beautiful item and a really sort of lovely example of that style of carving.
And Tim? He has no regrets about buying it.
We probably know for certain that it's not a Thomas Sharp object, but actually I think it really is a very nice object indeed.
All the world's a stage, and today, Stratford-upon-Avon is a place of pilgrimage for millions of Shakespeare lovers worldwide. While they may not own an antique directly related to the great playwright himself, there are plenty of mementos of his enduring contribution to history. Throughout the ages, man has always tried to capture the world around him, from the earliest cave drawings to art, photography, and even virtual reality. But there was one early pioneer who took it upon himself to explore new heights in this never-ending pursuit.
It's really exciting when objects like this just turn up out of the blue, and it offers an insight into things that we might not have known before.
Earth from space, thousands of feet up. Move closer, and satellites and drones can now give us a valuable bird's eye view of great architectural landscapes, like Berlin, Paris, and New York. "125 years ago, the technology to do this was more primitive.
People always associate the capability of taking aerial photographs with aeroplane flight, whereas in fact there were a lot of pioneer aerial photographers who went up in balloons.
Now, in an auction house in England,
1,000 to 1,050 is against you.
auctioneer Chris Albury has unearthed a photographic one-off.
What we're looking at here is the earliest known surviving aerial photograph of Great Britain.
And there's this, one of the earliest photographs in existence of the Eiffel Tower. This unique collection is a crucial part of the story of early aerial photography. So how did it end up here? This photograph of Crystal Palace is on a glass slide designed to be projected onto a wall using a magic lantern, an early precursor to the PowerPoint presentation. It's among 76 glass slides by Cecil Vincent Shadbolt, one of the world's pioneering hot air balloonist photographers. Auctioneer Chris Albury takes up the story of how these 19th century artifacts were unearthed.
A dealer who took a punt on a large collection of 5 boxes of magic lantern slides, buyer collects, no information about what was in there. He took a punt, went to London, collected them, took them back home and started to look through them. He didn't know who Shadbolt was or anything about him, but he realised he was onto something quite significant.
Shadbolt's glass slide collection dates from 1882 and includes aerial views of London, like the River Thames, his hydrogen-filled balloon, and scores of coloured slides. It documents 10 years of work, and confirming its provenance was not difficult.
They're part of a ballooning lecture, and we've got the title slide of his whole lecture series here. Here we go, here's the title slide for Shadbolt's lecture series, Balloons and Ballooning, Upward and Onwards by C.V. Shadbolt, and that's numbered 1 on the slide, and that's really gave us the definitive clue that these were Shadbolt's slides, undoubtedly.
Cecil Vincent Shadbolt, seen here on the left, was an amateur photographer who grew up in London in the 1850s. A lover of scenic landscapes, he took up aerial photography with the help of his ballooning friend, Captain William Dale, seen here on the right. The modern era of flight took off in France in 1783 when the Montgolfier brothers demonstrated their new invention, the hot air balloon. The first manned flight flew over Paris for almost half an hour, much to the awe of the gathering crowds. Their success at the time was a sensation and paved the way for generations of flying machines. Two years later, just as America was in the midst of the War of Independence, Boston-born American Dr. John Jeffries and his companion, Jean-Pierre Blanchard, made the first successful flight across the English Channel. They set off from Dover in a hydrogen balloon and only stayed airborne by throwing out all ballast, including their clothes. The venture put long-distance ballooning on the map, and by the 19th century, the pastime had become a real showstopper.
By the time Shadbolt was flying, the balloon was pretty much established as a sort of fairground attraction. It was something that people would pay money to go and see, and people would do bizarre things like parachuting out of balloons or hoisting animals up and performing various amazing feats. It was very much a fairground spectacle, but at the same time there was this tradition of using balloons as a vehicle for scientific experiments at altitude.
Martin Barber has spent years studying Shadbolt and was instrumental in buying these slides at auction for historic England. This extraordinary but fragile collection has to be stored in a special temperature-controlled environment.
In the 1880s, he was known quite widely as the first person to take a successful aerial photograph looking straight down at the ground, producing a sort of vertical map-like view. He'd actually designed a hinged plate to attach to the balloon basket so that he could actually point his camera at any angle he wanted.
This historic photo of Stamford Hill shows just how successful Shadbolt's vertical aerial photography was. He exhibited this slide under the title, "An Instantaneous Map Photograph," in the belief this method was the way forward for map making.
It actually captures within this image a lot of what he was interested in. He wasn't photographing the landmarks, he wasn't taking off flying over London photographing Tower of London, Houses of Parliament, that sort of thing. What he seems to have been interested in was the growth of London, the new suburbs. So he's photographing places like Stamford Hill where, if you look very closely, you can see there is actually building work going on. London is in the process of growing. These are areas that weren't on the Ordnance Survey map. He's documenting the expansion of London, which I think is part of this point he was making about aerial photography for cartographic purposes.
In the 1880s, Shadbolt wasn't the only pioneering balloonist who believed the future of cartography lay in aerial photographs. There was the Frenchman Nadar, who was forced to make personal sacrifices for his art.
Camera technology at the time meant that he had to prepare, develop and expose his plates within about a 15 to 20 minute window, which meant he had to take his darkroom facilities up in the balloon basket, which obviously added to his problems because, you know, the one thing that you need to get a balloon up is as little weight in a balloon basket as possible. And in fact, on his first successful flight, where he took his first photograph, according to his own account, he had to remove pretty much all of his clothing because he was flying in December and he had this big winter clothing on, and he said he just gradually kept removing items and chucking things out of the basket until he managed to get the balloon to a sufficient height to take a photograph.
That first aerial photograph was of a French village. Sadly, it no longer survives. The one aerial photograph in the collection not of London is that of the Eiffel Tower. Taken in 1889, shortly after the iconic landmark was opened for the very first time. The picture was taken from a tethered balloon 1,000 feet in the air. But Shadbolt's main interest was charting the social development of London. Capturing its impressive architectural features was of less interest.
This is probably the only slide in the collection that actually features one of the famous landmarks of London. It's slightly blurry. It shows the Crystal Palace, probably sometime in the mid to late 1880s, as I say, we don't know precisely. Took off a number of times from here.
This collection shows just how important Shadbolt's contribution to aerial photography was. Little documentation of his exploits still exist, and sadly, his pioneering work ended all too soon in 1893.
His flying career didn't last very long, unfortunately, because just 10 years after his first flight, he was killed at the Crystal Palace when he went up in a balloon with a friend of his, and the balloon envelope split open when they were a few hundred feet up and crashed straight back down to the ground again.
Shadbolt was just 33 when he died. Now, thanks to a chance online buy and Historic England's interest, Shadbolt's pioneering work survives so the public can appreciate it for years to come. They say that great oaks from little acorns grow, and And that's certainly true of this next small but incredibly precious item. These tiny tools were the starting point to creating some of the most impressive and iconic architecture the world has ever seen.
Objects like these tell stories, and it's about keeping those stories alive for generations in the future.
Bath, a British spa town famed for its iconic Georgian buildings like the Circus, the Royal Crescent, and Queen Square. The brainchild behind this celebrated architectural style was the 18th century British designer and town planner, John Wood the Elder.
As an architect, John Wood the Elder was a real visionary. He took ideas that lots of people were playing with and he really innovates them in a way that other people had never done.
Now, in an extraordinary turn of fortune, this very toolkit Wood used to lay out his vision for this city has come to light in an auction house more than 250 years after his death.
When you see something really rare that none of us have seen before, that's when you know you've got something special.
Its discovery came on a routine day at this auction house, when the owner arrived with the wallet buried in a bag of bric-a-brac. She had no idea what she had.
Her husband had been a draftsman at British Aerospace, and so had obviously had an interest in drawing, but she has no idea when he acquired it, and it just languished in a drawer for many, many years. There was no link back to the Wood family, so they were surprised as we are.
What they had found was an astonishing piece of history. The ruler, dividers, and compasses were the working tools of an architect. Confirming their provenance was easy.
A lot of the clues were actually there with the piece. So, of course, we had the name John Wood and architect, but then we had the engraved family coat of arms. And with a bit of research, we were able to link that to the Wood family. The maker of the instrument set, a chap by the name of Heath of London, he was operating in London at the right sort of period. And so all these things come together to show that this has to be the genuine article, and there can be no doubt about its provenance.
That provenance gives it such significance as an object. So it's that sort of stamp of ownership that suddenly takes this from being a good set made by a good maker that would have been used by an 18th century architect into suddenly the set that was used by one of the most important British 18th century architects.
Sure of its provenance, Bath's Museum of Architecture bought the set of tools at auction. They're in no doubt how important this item was in helping John Wood draw up his blueprint for the city.
So suddenly, you're looking at the instruments that translated the idea of the architect into the actual building that you stand in front of. And that makes them extraordinary things to hold in your hand.
Born in Bath in 1704, John Wood was a self-educated building contractor, architect and town planner, with a particular vision for the city.
What he does is establishes how it would be laid out, the ideas of his town planning, this idea of geometric shapes linked together by long terraces of townhouses, which becomes influential not just across England, but all across Europe.
Wood's pioneering work inspired town planners throughout the continent. In the late 19th century, Georges Eugene Haussmann was commissioned by Emperor Napoleon to renovate Paris, creating beautiful neighbourhoods with boulevards and open spaces. In Bath, Wood's architectural ambitions were fuelled in part by the city's growing popularity for its restorative spa waters and as a place for leisure and entertainment.
And Wood is taking advantage of Bath when it's at its social peak. So there are hundreds of people flocking here because it's the most popular place to be and they need somewhere to stay. So he is fulfilling the demand for the need for housing.
Wood first incorporates his design ideas here in Queen Square, in rental homes for the fashionable and wealthy. Wood's trademark was to design these house facades in the Palladian style. Palladianism is a style based on the designs of the 16th century Italian Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio. Palladio was inspired by the buildings of ancient Rome. One of his iconic designs is the Church of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. In turn, designers drew on Palladio's work to create a more classical style.
So the main idea about this type of architecture is taking what was very familiar with an English country house and sort of transplanting it into the city. So the very fashionable elite members of society, when they come to Bath for a month of the year, they're leaving their large country estate, but they can live in the same kind of pomp and splendour in the city because they're living behind a building that looks like this, even though effectively it's just a terraced house.
John Wood was also thought to be a member of the Freemasons, an international organisation shrouded in mystery. Many of the designs in Wood's architectural work contain images and symbols considered significant by Freemasons.
So if you think of the sort of process the designer goes through in order to get the idea of a building engraved in a book, something like this, it's amazing to think that a few dividers, a compass, a couple of pens, a ruler, produces one of the key 18th century city buildings in England.
Thanks to these simple tools, John Wood turned this city into one of the best examples of Georgian architecture in the world. Perhaps considered his masterpiece was the Circus, 3 segmented rows of terraced houses formed into a circle.
This is really one of the most important British buildings of the 18th century. And this is also the building that almost certainly the drawing instruments were used to create, which is extraordinary, really. It's also the project that John Wood the Elder died during construction. So it's his great legacy, this building.
John Wood's son followed in his father's footsteps and, possibly using the very same tool set, went on to complete his father's work, which included the outstanding Royal Crescent in Bath. The influence of the Palladian style championed by John Wood can be seen all over the world, even as far away as the Brooklyn Museum in New York City. But none of this would have happened without these simple architectural tools. They're now on display at Bath's Museum of Architecture for all to see. And it's only thanks to fortune that they were ever found at all in this continuing tale of trading history.